Good evening, friends. This evening, we will celebrate the exhibition Actors and Courtesans in Ukiyo-e, Japanese prints from the collection of Lee E. Dirks. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's new rotation in the Japanese gallery features extraordinary gifts and promise gifts in honor of the museum's 150th anniversary. This evening, John Carpenter will introduce highlights of the extraordinary Ukiyo-e prints from the collection of Lee E. Dirks. Our members will recall that Lee was interviewed for the latest issue of Impressions, and we recommend that you all read this very, very special article. Since the exhibition will be on view only through the end of May of this year, we hope that this evening will inspire those nearby to visit in person, and all of you to appreciate this rare opportunity to view the prints up close in John's splendid presentation. Before we begin, let us briefly introduce our guests this evening. John Carpenter is the Mary Griggs Burke Curator of Japanese Art. A specialist in Japanese prints, eihon, literature, and surimono, he has served as the editor of Hokusai and His Age, Ukiyo-e painting, printmaking, and book illustration in late Edo, Japan, and Reading Surimono, the interplay of text and image in Japanese prints, and many, many other volumes. Since arriving at the Met, he has overseen numerous exhibitions and helped write and edit the accompanying catalogs, including Designing Nature, The Poetry of Nature, Edo Paintings from the Fishbein Bender collection, and most recently, The Tale of Genji, a Japanese classic. I also would like to note that following John's presentation, we will be joined by Lee Dirks from his Florida home. Lee has had a peripatetic life and distinguished career, all outlined in the JASA article. First as a reporter and editor with Dow Jones, then successively as the first full-time newspaper stock analyst on Wall Street, the general manager of the Detroit Free Press, and the founder of the nation's most active newspaper merger and acquisition firm. His focus in collecting art was first on paintings of New Mexico by nationally known early American modernists such as Georgia O'Keeffe, Edward Hopper, and George Bellows. And this led to his 21 years on the board of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe. JASA's audience will be most interested in his collection of Japanese art, and the fact that he seriously began collecting ukiyo-e in around 2004, although was first exposed to Japan and the arts of Japan while serving in the U.S. Air Force from 1958 to 1961. A multi-venue exhibition of his print collection was organized by the Nihon Keizai Shimbun in 2018-19. Hearing Lee speak firsthand will be another highlight of our program tonight. And now, I turn the podium over to John Carpenter.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you very much, Allison Tolman, Victoria Melendez, other members of the JASA Programs Committee for organizing this event tonight. And I would like to thank Helen Goldenberg for taking care of the logistics for this evening's presentation. And of course, I thank Lee Dirks for both his generosity and enthusiasm in supporting this exhibition at the Metropolitan, which will be on view until May 31st. I hope that many of you will be able to visit in person, but tonight I would like to give you a virtual tour of the exhibition and give a little bit of background for how this exhibition came to be. The exhibition had its genesis in Japan in 2018 And Lee's collection, including over 160 prints, went to 5 different cities in Japan and had a wonderful reception, and even went to Shokokuji Temple at the Jotenkaku Museum. And here you see Lee with Reverend Arima Raite and Lee's wife Donna Bradley and her son and daughter-in-law. And the exhibition had wonderful attendance every day that it was shown in each of the venues. Catalog was created, popular impressions, Japanese prints from the Lee Dirks collection, which is still available online through various booksellers. And we have presented just a small portion of that exhibition. Of the 160 or so prints, I selected 35 prints focusing on figural subjects, especially courtesans of the Yoshiwara demimonde, and then actors of the Kabuki stage. But as you'll see, there's several other aspects of popular culture are represented in the exhibition. The display in the print room at the Met is part of a larger exhibition that will be going on until April next year. And what we see here is perhaps the youngest readers of Lee's catalog in one of the rooms of the exhibition. And what we have done in the print room is for each of the 4 rotations of the print room, we've picked a different theme related to ukiyo-e, but this is one of the styles that's investigated in the grand exhibition that takes over all 10 galleries of the Japan galleries at the Met. When you enter the print room, you are surrounded by a constellation of exceedingly rare prints, mostly hand-colored, dating from around 1680 to the 1720s. And to begin my discussion, I go right back to the works of Hishikawa Morinobu, who retroactively is viewed as the founder of the Ukiyo-e school. Ukiyo-e literally meaning pictures of the floating world, referring to the Yoshiwara pleasure quarters or the demimonde and the Kabuki stage. But you'll see how the term ukiyo-e came to be used more expansively. But how appropriate it is that Morinobu was viewed as the founder of the school. He came from a family of textile designers and purveyors. And in Morinobu's designs, you'll see how he brought this awareness of textile design right into his prints. Now, on the right-hand side is the print in the exhibition belonging to Lee Dirks. On the left-hand side is an impression that's been in the Met's collection for many years. This is a sumizuri-e, ink printed only in a single block to create the outlines of the design. But look at how it's transformed by hand coloring to be this kind of deluxe print for a special customer. This hand coloring probably dates to the time Morinobu created the print, but what we see here is the foundation of everything that I'm going to say in today's presentation, where you see the interaction between a young man on the left, a wakashu, identifiable by his unshaven forelocks, and then this upright top knot. But look at how he's dressed so flamboyantly, as though he's enjoying wearing female garments, very colorful and bright, pleasant. But he is with a female entertainer who has just put down her shamisen, the three-stringed instrument associated with the pleasure quarters and kabuki. And they are sharing intimate glances. This print belongs to a set of 14 erotic prints. And as you know, often in the series of Makura-e or pillow pictures, now known as shunga, often the earliest in the series are very tame and they are just a tease. And another from the same series, once again, shows a wakashu and a young woman. They're frolicking in front of a screen. But this is the beginning of the ukiyo-e movement, and we'll see how Morinobu, as a print designer, book illustrator, and painter, started to make a popular art affordable by every member of society. In the exhibition, we're also delighted to be able to share a recent gift from Lee of a 23-foot hand scroll showing a Daimyo Procession to Edo. And in researching this scroll, the late Nagata Seiji declared that he felt that this was the work of Hishikawa Morinobu or his studio. And I wondered what he was referring to. But when I looked closely at it, for instance, the young wakashu escorts mounted on horses in the scroll, when you look at them very closely in the way that the garments are described and the facial features, they do in fact bespeak the style of the Morinobu studio. Or perhaps even more revealingly is at the very beginning of this scroll, in a scene not usually found in Daimyo Procession scrolls, you see a family enjoying the spectacle of this large parade of colorfully dressed attendants to a daimyo going by. And you can see the depiction of this family and the young children is very much in the Hishikawa Morinobu mode. And as we look around to see the prints that are in this opening section of the display, we find an exceedingly rare print attributed to Sugimura Jihei that does not show a kabuki actor, does not show anything related to the demimon, but it's a reminder that Sugimura, just at the time that Morinobu was active, was creating a new type of Japanese print, once again hand-colored using lead oxide tan, that popularized some of the most famous of Japanese classics. In this case, the tale of the Heike, and we see here the image of Taira no Atsumori at the Battle of Ichinotani, referring to the late 12th century battle, the Genpei Wars. And we associate this with Sugimura Jihei based on other rare prints. For instance, this is the only known impression I've ever seen of this particular scene. If anyone comes across another, please let me know. But when we compare it to an equally rare, also unique, I believe, image in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, you can see not only in the depiction of the figures and the use of perspective and the coloration, you can see similarities, perhaps confirming that Sugimura Jihei is responsible for this rare imprint. So once again, we have the popularization of the Japanese literary classics, creating easy to afford pictures of favorite episodes. This is another function of Ukiyo-e, was the popularization of literature. Now, here we have a Sumizuri-e. This was never colored in, but it reveals so much about the very beginnings of actor prints that I'm going to talk about in today's presentation. Now, when you look at this dynamic scene, the season is just right for now. They're on a cherry blossom excursion, enjoying a banquet outdoors beneath banners that have the actors' crests. And we have Nakamura Denkuro on the right as a Yakko, a feudal retainer, whose scowling features is be damned with you, gesturing ruffian stance, which encapsulates the exaggeratedly boisterous aragoto, rough stuff roles for which he became famous. And then in front of him is Matsumoto Hyozo, who delighted his audiences and achieved great fame for his sensuous performances as an onagata, male actors who cross-dressed on stage as women. Yet the scene here captures an even more complex permutation of gender roles, since the kerchief he's wearing, which would normally be purple if you saw it on the stage, is an attribute of a man playing a female role. But the character depicted represents the role of a wakashu, as I described in the Moronobu prints. Once again, here a male youth attired in feminine garb. But in this case, the actor is shown in flamboyant robes, a pair of swords tucked into a sash, but with a woman's hairstyle, the more vertical top knot of a, not the more vertical top knot that we associated with the wakashu. During this period, and here we are right around 1700, or for about 10 years before that, these were called nisei wakashu goto. These are imitation male youths. And they had a surge in popularity, though since prints capturing such poses are extremely rare, we must assume that audiences were content for wakashu to be wakashu, for boys to be boys on the Kabuki stage. Now here is a perfect encapsulation of what I just mentioned, of the aragoto, the rough stuff roles associated with the Ichikawa clan of actors. We can tell this is an Ichikawa family actor because of the Mimasu crest, the triple rice measuring box crest on the sleeves of the costume, but we don't know if this is Ichikawa Danjuro the first, though it may be. At this time, there is still not a concern with representation of actual actors' features. And what we see here is performing a role showing the Setsubun, the spring equinox ritual, where you toss roasted soybeans, and then you try to exorcise demons, and you say out loud, "Oni wa soto, fuku wa uchi." Demons be gone, good luck enter. And so this kind of aragoto, rough stuff performance, will be associated with Ichikawa actors through the centuries. But Tori Kiyomasu could also create very delicate, very subdued imagery like we have here of the tragic lovers Osome and Hisamatsu. These are two young people who fell in love, but their parents didn't approve of the marriage, and then they died by love suicide. And this story was repeated again and again with variations on the plot in Jorori puppet plays, as well on the Kabuki stage. And here above the two actors, though we can't identify them, the libretto associated with the story, and we have a tragic moment at the end of their lives where they're sharing time together. She's attending a little tray garden. But a new era in woodblock print design emerges at the time of Okumura Masanobu. He was a pioneer in so many ways. He experimented with different types of prints. He was an innovator in creating the idea of mitate or yatsushie, which are parodies of the Chinese or Japanese classics. And in this case, we have a courtesan entertaining a client, and she is periodically representing Tekkai, a Chinese immortal who was able to move outside his own body. And so what we see here is the courtesan who has been entertaining a client with a smoking set and with pouring sake for him, which the cup is toppled over, and he's obviously drunk and probably has become boorish. She's imagining that she could be outside her body, outside the Yoshiwara pleasure quarters, and she transforms her spirit to the screen nearby. And even though this is not signed, there is a complete set of this series of courtesans as immortals in the British Museum. And here you can see what it originally looked like in the Sumizuri-e when it was just ink printed instead of the deluxe version that you see in the Dirks collection, which has elaborate rendering in bright colors to bring the print to life. And in the lower right-hand corner, you see, in fact, one of the images is signed Okumura Masanobu. And so we know that the entire set could be attributed to Masanobu. But Masanobu was not only an innovator in the themes of ukiyo-e, he also loved to play with optical effects, optical devices, with perspective. And in this wonderful, exceedingly rare print by Masanobu, we see a courtesan and the two young attendants enjoying a revolving shadow lantern. And you can see when they light a candle in it, it causes the lantern to rotate as though a procession of courtesans is in movement. And above, we have the names of various establishments of the Yoshiwara pleasure quarters. Once again, keep in mind that all of the bright coloration seen here was applied afterwards by hand. And I just want to briefly introduce some prints from this transitional stage of coloring. The Yoshinobu print has hand coloring, but also note that you have a little glistening area, and this is where you have animal glue added to ink, and it creates the effect of lacquer. And so these came to be called urushi-e. And then on the left-hand side, you see the beginnings, an incipient form of printing where just 2 colors could be printed with blocks. So it's the first stage of the idea of a polychrome print. And just while I'm with the Kiyohiro print on the left, I want to notice that something that was always interesting to Lee when he was collecting is if the provenance of a print was distinguished, that added to the prestige of the work. And this has no fewer than 3 collector's seals, Henri Vevey, Wakai Oyaji, and then Hayashi Tadamasa, 3 of the great collector dealers of the turn of the century. So it has quite a distinguished provenance. And one more print that by Shikanaga, it would take hours for me to unravel all the poems and the identities of all of the actors and the musical instruments they play. It's a wonderfully complex and rare print, an undivided triptych, and elsewhere I've translated the poems here, but I just want to introduce this print right now as another instance of Benizuri-e, or the idea of printing done with limited colors. But this is where the revolution in woodblock print production begins, with Suzuki Harunobu, who took the figural style established by Nishikawa Tsukenobu in Kyoto earlier in the century, and he took these features and he created this type of androgynous figure where you can never tell the difference between the male and female figures in Harunobu's prints unless you look at the garments or the hairstyles or the other accoutrements. And here, Harunobu is so famous for the use of yatsushi or mitate, the idea of taking a Japanese classic and transforming the gender, changing the gender of a figure from the past, whether it's the procession to the journey to the east from the tales of Issei, and you have the male protagonist of the tale transformed into a young woman of Harunobu's own day. Harunobu loved to play with this idea, and so many of his prints can be considered to be parodies of the ancient Japanese classics. But for today, I would like to emphasize something different about Harunobu, and that's his radical role as a pioneer in the polychrome print, the nishiki-e, literally the brocade print. And here, whether it's a family journeying to a shrine dance, to a kagura dance, or on the left, a young woman and attendant are overlooking the new Yoshiwara quarters in print of 1768 or so, where the setting sun behind Mount Fuji creates this wonderful perspectival effect. But what Harunobu will always be remembered for is how he made the coloration of prints so complex. For instance, just to show you what took place in creating these prints, once you appreciate how complex that each color had to be created by a separately carved block, and the printer had to be exceedingly skilled in applying color. Keep in mind, the print designer, the artist that I'm focusing on today, were brilliant indeed, but without these skilled artisans, the print could not be successful. And for every stage of the print, you had to create a separate block, whether it's the key block with just the poems and the outlines of the figures. Then for each color that was added, you had to have a separate block. And then even if there was embossing, gaufrage, that had to be done as a separate block. So keep in mind the incredible complexity of these prints. Now, the next stage in our discussion of images of actors and courtesans, I'll move to this transformative, revolutionary print by Katsukawa Shunsho. This dates to around 1780. We don't have a crest on the costume, but most scholars now assume this is Bando Mitsugoro I. This is an exceedingly rare, very early example of a half-length Kabuki actor portrait. It anticipates the more common use of the format, first by other Katsukawa school artists, then by the Utagawa school artists, and then of course by Sharaku. When you look at this print with the actor with his arms crossed, his shoulders hunched, with this interrogating gaze, the actor seems poised for a confrontation. And we have other representations in the present exhibition by other Katsukawa school actor print artists. The Shunsho with magnificent color. It just shows how Katsukawa school artists were establishing a sophisticated set of visual codes for each individual actor. They were based on actual features, though they were simplified and abstracted to create a type of likeness portrait, Nigao-e. But for less famous actors, the crests on the costumes still could help Kabuki fans identify the actors in a play. Now, here we have Lee Dirks sharing his views on a wall of Sharaku and Kunimasa prints. And Sharaku established a reputation as a great portrayer of Kabuki actors, but his true ability was to be able to capture both the features and the mood of the actor in a simple, almost caricaturish manner that conveys great emotive power. For instance, here, this Ichikawa Yaozo III as Tanabe Bunzo, you get the sense that, well, even if you don't know the plot of the play, that the samurai is maybe powerless, hunched shoulders, his gently clasped hands are inside his sleeves, slightly unkempt hair, has a look of resignation. This is from the 5th month of 1794. Belongs to a group of prints by Sharaku, all created from this time, no later than the 2nd month of 1795. For instance, you have in this incredible print, this dynamic double bust portrait, it's against a dark gray mica background. It's a wonderful study in contrasting personality types. The scowling character on the right, known derisively as dried codfish Bodara Chozaemon, he's played by Nakajima Wadaemon, is shown dressing down the homeless boatman, Gon, played by Nakamura Konozo. Well, it's from a vendetta play. Lee told me that his nickname for this is the Two Nasties. But when you look at it, see what Sharaku was able to do, as I mentioned, not only capturing the appearance of the actors in a simplified form, but capturing a mood. It's quite remarkable, and he didn't worry about making an actor look handsome as some previous print artists had done. And some people say that because he didn't glamorize the actors, this is one of the reasons that he disappeared from the scene. But I don't believe that theory for a minute. He was being hired by managers from the three great Kabuki theaters of the day, and some went into second edition. These must have been very popular prints at the time. We don't know exactly why Sharaku disappeared within 10 months of appearing on the scene in Edo. Kunimasa is one of the great artists of the Utagawa school. You can see him capturing the two quintessential types of Kabuki actors, the onagata on the right, a male actor playing a female role, and then the idea of the actor of aragoto roles of with this makeup and showing with the crossed eyes that indicate a climactic moment in a Kabuki drama, the mie, where the actor knots his energy and movements into a frozen pose. And this Kunimasa's print captures this so effectively. And I was delighted to see that at Shokokuji, this was actually selected as the poster image. And created this very same year as the Kunimasa actor portraits, Toyohiro's created a most unusual image from a series of pictures of people from the Ryukyu Islands. This is also 1796. And this shows on the right a Gakudoji. These are boy performers that would often be in retinues of feudal lords. These are often children of wealthy families. Their young sons trained in the arts of calligraphy, painting, but also dance and music. And they would join the retinues and they would cross-dress in elegant women's robes and do dance and song performances. Very rare print, but Toyohiro did a number of other prints on this theme of views of the Ryukyu Islands, of course, Okinawa. And we only have one Tori Kiyonaga print in the exhibition, but what a wonderful example it is. And as we move along in our discussion of the presentation of women of the pleasure quarters, women of various classes of Edo, we see how Kiyonaga in the 80s, 1780s, 1790s, represent the tendency to create women ever taller with more svelte figures. This particular image from a set of 20 designs of people from various classes is in superb condition. So many times Kiyonaga prints show up in the market so faded, but here to have the pristine yellows and even the purples surviving and the bright reds, It's really a wonderful example of Kiyonaga's work and demonstrates what a great colorist he was. And now I must move to some of the most popular prints of the entire exhibition. And of course, Kitagawa Utamaro's print called in English, Wistful Love, Mono Omoe Koi, the kind of love that's melancholy, reflecting on a lost love, or a love that you hope for but you know is unattainable. In his large head pictures, the Okubi-e, Utamaro wanted to declare himself to be the physiognomist par excellence. He could capture the state of mind of the woman by representing her physical characteristics in these expressions. And he created an entire series devoted to this particular theme. And then the mica backgrounds make the work stand out almost as though the figures are up against mirrors. And then one of my favorite Utamaro prints shows a tea house waitress. She's behind a bamboo blind. It's from the series of 8 views of tea stalls in celebrated places. But what I like about this print is the way it plays with optical effects and the idea that we are the voyeur looking at the woman through a bamboo blind, and then she's looking at her reflection in a hand mirror, and then the only way that we can see her face directly is through the indirect means of a reflected image. Utamaro was brilliant at creating such effects, playing with the devices of optics, of mirrors, of voyeurism. Now, this idea of optics provides a perfect segue to one of the rarest of rare prints in this exhibition, and that's Hokusai's telescope print. And I only know 3 impressions surviving in the entire world that I've seen published. It's extremely rare. Hokusai, signing himself Kako, dating from to about 1801-02. It has the most unusual title of the series, Furyu Nakute Nanakuse. Well, this is perhaps translated as fashionable, frivolous habits. 7 frivolous habits. And it derives from a Japanese saying, nakute nanakuse, meaning that even if you say you have none, actually you have 7 bad habits, or you have 7 frivolous habits. And so it was a saying of the time, and to put furyu in front of it means it's fashionable, up to date. But part of the novelty of this, of course, is the telescope. My colleague at SOAS, the University of London, Timon Screech, has written eloquently about the idea of the telescope in Japanese culture. In his most recent book, The Shogun's Silver Telescope, he tells the remarkable story of how in 1611, King James I sent an envoy to Japan, which arrived in 1613 and presented a gift from the king to the retired shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu of a silver gilt telescope. And it's quite remarkable to think that this type of telescope wasn't even being produced until 1608 in Europe. So it's a remarkable story of the telescope in Japanese culture. And Hokusai, almost 200 years later, was similarly fascinated by the telescope, which by that time had been accepted into Japanese colors by scholars, by astronomers, by amateurs who wanted to be able to play with this novel device. And we see it in Hokusai's Kyoka book of samurai women on an outing. And that's what we see in Hokusai's print with a Japanese-made lacquered telescope. And we see Hokusai and Surimono showing once again this novel device which fascinated him. And in this series, I've only found one other example of the 7, and it's just someone eating hozuki, the Chinese lantern plant, which I guess they consider to be a frivolous habit. But I was trying to reflect on why viewing a telescope or peering through a telescope would be a bad habit. It seems like quite an admirable thing for samurai women, perhaps a mother and daughter on an outing. But since Hokusai is calling it a frivolous habit, perhaps what they're saying is that they're actually spying on men just as they go out on an outing to enjoy cherry blossoms. And I did find that Hokusai had written a senryu, a humorous 17-syllable poem on the theme of the telescope. And what he's remarking is that when you peer through a telescope, you have to squint with one eye and your face gets distorted, just as though you're being your shoulders are being burnt by moxibustion for the first time. The first time you're hit with the moxa is very, very painful, and then you get used to it. And so he's saying that your face gets distorted, and it's very inelegant for a lady to be seen squinting when she uses a telescope. So perhaps that's the bad habit or the frivolous habit that Hokusai is referring to. Now, I would like to bring my comments to a close by going into the mid-19th century, and Kuniyoshi is presenting himself as the ukiyo-e artist in the guise of the magical carpenter of Japan, Hidari no Jingoro. He's there with his pet cat, and Kuniyoshi loved his cats, but he is creating sculptures of famous religious figures and famous cultural figures that are so realistic that they come to life. And just like the statue of Shotoku Taishi, very close to the one that's actually in the Japan A History of Style exhibition at this very moment, Kuniyoshi is presenting himself as a magical artist. And then Kuniyoshi also had to deal at this time with censorship rules that prevented artists from putting identifiable or named actors or courtesans in prints. There was censorship against this because it was injurious to morals. But of course, Kuniyoshi very cleverly goes in and he creates images of turtles that have likeness portraits of the famous Kabuki actors of the day. And for some of them, the crest of the actor is woven into the carapace of the turtle. And they're all moving towards a sake cup. And then the final 2 images of the exhibition show Kunisada representing a printmaking studio where you have craftspeople carving blocks, applying sizing, working with the colorants that they will apply. But something is wrong with these images showing the four classes, because these professions were male dominated. And what Kunimasa has done is playfully transformed the genders of the workmen into women, townswomen dressed in elegant costumes, and then also in the accompanying print showed a a bookseller's gallery, where the prints that normally would have been produced by men, sold by men, are shown in transformed identities. Kunimasa has replaced the expected contingent of male workers with fashionably dressed townswomen, leading viewers, both past and present, to reflect on gender stereotypes, in an echo of the companion print showing a printmaker's studio. And Kunimata's clever device playing on gendered imagery reminds us of the wonderfully diverse history of the depiction of men and women in ukiyo-e prints. It now only remains for me to encourage you, if you can, to come visit the exhibition in person. And if that proves impossible for the time being, please enjoy it vicariously in the various publications, in the Arts of Asia, impressions on the Metropolitan's website. And I look forward to welcoming you all again sometime in the near future. Thank you very much. I'm also happy to take questions after this.
Thank you, John. And we do have some questions. I think that Amy is going to perhaps start with Lee first, and then I will volley the print questions to you.
John, thank you for a fantastic talk and superb tutorial. And I'm just waiting for Lee to join us on the screen. We're here with Allison Tolman, and there he is. Lee, welcome to JASA, and we're so thrilled you're here. Lee, we wanted to ask you a few questions. Mostly we're interested in your own personal criteria as a collector of ukiyo-e, but there's such a range in this collection. Can you tell us some of your favorites?
Yes, be delighted to. John has already touched a great deal on most of them. As a matter of fact, it's very hard, of course, to pick a single favorite or even identify five or so. But I would identify. Certainly, I have to mention the Hokusai, obviously the telescope print. As John said, it's one of only three in the world. The other two are located in Japanese museums, but I like the symbolism, if you will, of the beauty looking through the telescope. When I first had the opportunity to consider acquiring this print, I thought instantly of the fact that would make a wonderful cover for a catalog if ever an exhibition of my works were to be developed, and indeed that's what happened. Of course, I'm interested also in the fact that that telescope is a Western telescope, and Hokusai was executing this print, one of his very earliest prints, in 1800 or 1801 or 1802, right in that period of time. And of course, all Western goods were prohibited from entering Japan except through one very small port, a Dutch settlement, an island that was built for Dutch merchants in the Bay of Nagasaki. So that particularly appealed to me. Certainly the very early Okubiye which is on your screen right now, by Shunsho. My primary dealer, Sebastian Izard, believes this is one of the first, if not perhaps the very first, Okubiye or close-up portrait that was done in Japanese woodblock print, in the history of Japanese woodblock prints, and that certainly presages the incredible print Okubiye by such artists as Sharaku and Utamaro and others a decade and a half later, or 2 decades later as well. The Sharaku double portrait has been a favorite of mine, one of the earlier Sharakus that I was able to acquire, which, as John mentioned, Sebastian refers to as the Two Nasties. And that's another favorite. I could go on, but enough for that.
Well, we're very, very lucky, Lee, that you had an opportunity to find so many early and superb prints in phenomenal condition. And I'm not sure if this is something you were seeking out from the beginning, or was it just a moment in time when you were very, very fortunate that you had an interest and you were there first before anyone else could get to them. And I'd like to also ask John to also offer his comments about this moment of time and collecting, and how fortuitous it was for Lee to be able to find these phenomenal prints.
Well, it was a combination of fortuitous circumstances. There was a wonderful exhibition, as I recall, at the Asia Society about 12 or 13, perhaps 14 years ago, which focused on very early prints. And that made me aware of them. And of course, I appreciated the importance of those. But that gets to a kind of a larger topic, which that I might just mention, which is that I have sought in collecting these prints over the past, what I would call museum quality prints, over the past 15 years or so. I've really sought to try to build a collection that is as comprehensive as possible in several ways. First, I've tried to collect at least one work by virtually every truly important artist during the 250 years from the earliest Ukiyo-e in 1680 all the way through not only the Edo era, which ended in 1868, but also through the Meiji era and the Taisho era, and therefore the first 250 years of woodblock prints, which goes from 1680 or so to the mid 1920s. And if I'm going to do that, I recognized early on that I certainly needed to acquire hopefully several very, very early prints. So I felt very fortunate. It was fortunately that several became available just at about the right time, 10 or 12 or 13 years ago.
And John, how do you feel about this moment of collecting and collecting prowess, I should say, and at the same time you're sitting on one of the great collections of ukiyo-e in America at the Metropolitan Museum of Art?
And you're asking, how do I feel about collecting today?
Well, we'd love to hear that, and then we'd also like to hear John's reaction to that. So Lee, please
John?
continue.
You could continue, but they were asking.
What's
John.
that?
You could continue, but they were asking John. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I'm not understanding you.
She said you could go ahead and continue answer that, and then John.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm confusing. I have a bit of a hearing problem, so, but I have a wonderful interpreter here by my side. Well, continuing on that theme, therefore, I've tried not only to acquire at least one work by every important artist, but I've also sought to own at least one example of important trends, for example, in colors, which John has so brilliantly outlined, starting out with the fact that the original woodblock prints were simply produced from one block, and therefore were simply black and white. And in order to get colors, they had to hand color each of those prints. Then, of course, going to the two-color prints in the early to mid 1700s, winding up with the full-blown so-called Nishiki-e shortly after 1750, and then, for example, along came in the middle to latter part of the 1820s, the arrival of Prussian blue as a color that became an important color, especially in presenting landscapes, which of course were so incredibly popular as subjects in the 19th century. And so I made sure that I acquired one or two Aizurrie, that, as they call them, which are pictures of basically almost entirely in various colors of the spectrum that would be described as blue. Another example would be formats. I've made sure that I acquire several Hashira-e, the pillar prints, and several Ukiyo-e, the perspective prints, which then led to the, I think you'd say that they were predecessors of the landscape prints of the 19th century. And fan prints, which are called Ukiyo-e, the fan prints, which are so wonderful. And then in terms of designs, of course, the arrival of the Okubi-e and the early landscapes and all. And then finally, another way in which I've tried to be comprehensive is that in addition to prints that were produced in Edo, now Tokyo, at the same time, some very interesting and very important prints that can be recognized by the scholar, if not by people like me, perhaps. Osaka prints. I have managed to acquire several Osaka prints, several prints from Nagasaki, which was producing some artists there, largely unknown by many unknown by name, or several unknown by name, were being produced starting in the very early 1800s, and then of course Yokohama prints, which were produced by several artists, starting right after the arrival of Admiral Perry in the early to mid 1850s. So the point in my collecting was to try to have some interesting and first-rate examples of these various types of prints.
Well, we really appreciate your sharing your perspectives and your criteria for your collection and what makes it so very, very special. And I do want to bring John into the conversation to before we talk about specific prints and specific questions from our audience, for you also to talk about this moment in time for you as a curator of one of the greatest collections of ukiyo-e and ehon in our country. Now having these prints, this is a moment where most museums have not been able to keep up with the market and buying in these last 15 years. How does this appeal to you, and how are you responding to that?
Thank you, Amy. First, to respond to the comments that Lee made, his collection, of course, is very comprehensive. And if you get a copy of the catalog, or if you look at Julia Meach's interview in Impressions, the latest issue of Impressions, you'll see the broad scope of Lee's collection. But for this display at the Met, I wanted to focus on what I felt was the very rarest of his collection, including those early ukiyo-e prints. And very few collectors are able to find these rare impressions. So that's one area we focused. And then the other thing that Lee has been able to do, and it's very hard to pull off at this late stage of collecting history, is to get impressions in good condition and pristine quality. And so that's very important. It's getting harder and harder for any museum to acquire prints directly, because as you see the prints, when an impression of the Great Wave goes for $1 million or $1.5 million, it's hard to justify that kind of acquisition for a museum when we have other areas, other lacunae to fill in the collection.
Allison.
Thank you so much. Lee, thank you. And now we're going to have a whole bunch of technical questions for the curator. First of all, and this is sort of because it's coming from a couple of different people, if you could define the term wakashu, John. And another question was, what indicated that the kimono worn in the print, the Motonobu print, what indicated that the kimono worn by the wakashu was a female garment?
The first, for wakashu, the definition of male youth, this has interestingly been defined by Joshua Masto and Asato Ikeda as the third gender, in between intermediate gender. These wakashu were often escorts, companions for samurai. They were also became kabuki performers often. So they were present in ukiyo-e prints right from the beginning. As for defining a garment as male or female, textile experts will know that that's often hard to do, but the bright color, the flowery designs, the flamboyant, for instance, on the pictures of people from Ryukyu, the Toyohiro print, to have blossoms in the hair in a bright pink outfit. This normally would be considered a woman's garment, but needless to say, when you see the genre painting of the 17th century, you often see men in flamboyant robes, and that tradition continues right through the Edo period.
Thank you. Another question is, all the prints are of wonderful quality, but the hand-applied colors on the Motonobu prints struck me as particularly amazing for the time. Did Motonobu have access to interesting or stable pigments as a purveyor of textiles?
I wouldn't say that's the reason. All ukiyo-e painters would have had access to a wide palette, a diverse palette of organic and mineral pigments, and Motonobu, of course, would be no exception. He was a painter, and if you look at his paintings, amazing array of color, and they had mastered the techniques of applying them. So who exactly within Motonobu's circle was commissioned to do the hand coloring? I don't think we have any clear evidence on that, but they had access to excellent quality colorants, yes.
This is another question about the very early ukiyo-e. Why are there no shadows? I assume that it was a fashion or a style not to draw them, but the flatness of Japanese perspectives always made me wonder why.
That is such a fantastic question because it gets right to the crux of a whole definition of style in Japanese art. This is not only in the characteristic of ukiyo-e, you will also see it in other earlier types of Japanese art. It's this idea of a graphic presentation of a bold, flat, graphic, abbreviated presentation of natural forms, of natural phenomena, of human forms is a characteristic of Japanese art right from the beginning, right through, even going up into manga. So this is one of the great appeals of ukiyo-e. I'm sure for Lee, as it is for me, the idea that a line almost done with calligraphic bravura can be so expressive without the use of shading. Now, for a technical ramification of this, this affects the way that you depict the human face. And that's why so many Japanese portraits have a 3/4 profile. It's very hard to do a full frontal portrait of an actor, a courtesan, a samurai, of anyone, full frontal, because the shape of the nose is becomes unseemly. And so shading the lack of shading became characteristic of Japanese art through the ages. I don't know if I answered exactly what the person was referring to, but it's a very complex, and you could write an entire book on the subject. Of course, once Western art was revealed, was introduced to Japan, experimenting with shadows and shading in art became a characteristic of distinctive characteristic of certain artists.
John, two more questions for you. The first one is, can you connect the emergence of individual identity with any social or political changes in Japanese society?
Great question. I suspect that something was happening, that as portraiture, the Nigao was developing, and the idea of identifying people with labels on prints. Yes, I suppose something was happening, but whether we could say it had to do with individualism or not, I couldn't say right now. I do think it's a super topic to pursue, and I'm sure that others have thought about this topic as well. Sorry, I can't give a quick answer.
Did this is a quick question about Kuniyoshi, and the person saying that they had heard that Kuniyoshi practiced No. Do you know if he also depicted any No plays or actors from No plays?
Lee, do you know anything about Kuniyoshi in No? I know other ukiyo-e artists that did that extensively. I don't know about Kuniyoshi in No, even though many of his images derive from themes that are in No plays. And maybe that's what the questioner is asking about.
Right. I'm not sure I can answer that specifically, but mentioning Kuniyoshi brings up the fact, I think, brings up a reference to the previous question about artists and politics, if that's oversimplifying that question. But to me, one of the most important themes that pops up periodically in Japanese woodblock prints is if, at least from a sideways standpoint, a theme of the current political situation, and the wonderful Kuniyoshi triptych. That's one of my favorites that you showed, John. Of course, called Turtle Fun, wonderful, wonderful, with 23 turtles with the heads of actors. Tells me a lot about what the political situation was like at that time. The government was forbidding the reproduction of images of actors and courtesans, but actors particularly, I think. But anyway, that didn't prevent Kuniyoshi from coming up with a very humorous print. I've often thought, as I've looked at that print, he wouldn't have gotten away with that in Hitler's Germany, I can assure you.
Mm.
And just to take another well-known print that is not in the exhibition, of course, a wonderful example of this, perhaps, well, a wonderful example was in Hiroshige's landscape series, 100 Views of Edo, sudden shower, and in that print he shows in the first state, which I happen to be fortunate to own thanks to Sebastian Izard some years back. In that first state, why he showed very clearly the location in relation to that specific grid of a warehouse for armaments that was owned by the shogun. Well, the censor came down on Hiroshige and required him to sublimate, if you will, the presence in the print of that storage across the river. And I've sometimes thought, it's a little bit like when I was in Washington in the 70s, and the CIA headquarters was not identified on the George Washington Parkway, its location. Well, everybody knew in Washington, D.C., everybody knew where the headquarters is located. And anyway, there was a political aspect to that I found quite interesting.
Lee, I wish that you were here all the time with us. It's an absolute pleasure to bring you onto our mini stage this evening, and especially to John for presenting this phenomenal exhibition, and even more so to taking us deeply into the prints. We know that all of you in our audience will enjoy our upcoming presentation on Wednesday, April 21st, when a colleague at the Met, Dr. Monica Binsick, will discuss the birth of fashion in Japanese textile art. And in that, she will be focusing on the social and political history of kosode, the T-shaped robes worn by men and women from the Momoyama through the Middle Edo periods. Everyone, thank you for joining, and we wish you all a good evening.